Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. Thank you for coming out on this absolutely magnificent, yes, finally spring day. My name is Eric Arneson from the George Washington University. I am the co-chair of this seminar along with Philippa Strum. She represents the Wilson Center. As many of you know, this seminar, which has been going on for many years now, is a joint effort on the part of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and the American Historical Association's National History Center. We're able to put on the programming that we do because of the generous support of a number of entities and individuals. The Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, Schaefer, has supported this seminar for many years, as has now the Department of History at George Washington University, as well as anonymous donors. And please, as I always say every week, please feel free to join their ranks. Behind the scenes, Amanda Perry and Pete Bierstecker work tirelessly to make sure that we have week after week of programming. And if I could ask you, if you've got one of these devices, and yes, every one of you does, if you could just take it out and make sure that it's on either vibrate or silent, we would very much appreciate it. They tend to go off at the most inopportune times. And with that, I turn this over to Philippa, who will introduce Professor Ayers this afternoon.
Thank you, Eric, and good afternoon, everybody. I am so pleased to introduce Professor Edward Ayers, who is the Tucker Boatwright Professor of the Humanities and President Emeritus of the University of Richmond, having earlier served as Dean at the University of Virginia. He is also the president of the Organization of American Historians for the 2017-2018 term. And in 2013, he was a recipient of a National Humanities Medal presented by President Obama. I won't give you the whole list of the books that he has written and edited because they are extraordinarily numerous. Just to give you a sense of them, there are titles like Vengeance and Justice, Crime and Punishment in the 19th Century American South, The Promise of the New South, Life After Reconstruction, which was a finalist for both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, What Caused the Civil War, Reflections on the South and Southern History, America's War, talking about the Civil War and Emancipation on their 150th anniversaries. He's the co-editor of numerous volumes. But while he has spent much of his intellectual life in the 19th century, he is firmly based in the 21st century. He is one of the hosts of Backstory, which is a weekly podcast that brings historical perspectives to the events happening around us today. And one of the important books for our discussion today is his volume called In the Presence of Mine Enemies, Civil War in the Heart of America, 1859 to 1863, which received the Bancroft Prize and the American Historical Association Beveridge Prize. And the book began the story of the Valley of the Shadow, from John Brown's raid to the eve of the Battle of Gettysburg. And so looking at Augusta County, Virginia, and Franklin County, Pennsylvania. And part of that project was Professor Ayers' co-editorship and co-authorship of the Valley of the Shadow, Two Communities in the American Civil War, which was not only a book, but a CD-ROM. And now there is a website on which you can see the original documents that went into not only that book, but the book that he's going to discuss with us today, which picks up from that point chronologically and is called The Thin Light of Freedom, the Civil War and Emancipation in the Heart of America. Professor Ayers.
Thank you so much. I'm standing up so that I can see people and wave my arms. So I have to do this. Crawl in behind here, fully amplified. Well, it's great to see everybody, and I appreciate the good questions I know you're going to ask. So let me dig into all this. Now, I have to admit, I wrote this book for people who don't think they're interested in the Civil War, because I imagine a lot of people don't, and for a long time I wasn't. But I finally decided if I was going to live my life in 19th century America, I was going to have to wrestle with the defining event in our nation's history. And this book I've written and this project I directed challenges a lot of what we think about the Civil War and a lot of what we teach our children. It argues that the profound changes of the war were profoundly unlikely. The immediate, complete, and uncompensated destruction of the most powerful system of slavery in the modern world, trying to create its own nation, followed by the enfranchisement of the formerly enslaved population and the recasting of the American Constitution, had seemed impossible just a few years before they came to pass. And in fact, it actually was impossible. It just happens to have happened. And it's important that we challenge this, because we have a sort of a fairy tale that it was, of course, we were going to rise up and destroy slavery and guarantee the sanctity of the Union. But that was not at all the case. So I believe that if we're going to understand that, we can't just stay in Washington, or we can't just stay in the general's tents. We're going to have to listen to what enlisted men, as well as the general, said, of what the struggles of enslaved people said, as well as of the people who held them in bondage. So to write such a history, we have to cross a lot of boundaries of genre, of geography, of topic, of approach, of digital and analog. We would need to include northern and southern people, black and white, male and female, soldier and civilian, Democrat and Republican. I decided that to try to understand the Civil War just by looking at one side is like trying to understand a battle just by looking at the maneuvers of one side. And I decided that the most advantageous ground to occupy to see all these people struggling with the same events would be the Great Valley that you see on the screen there that stretched across the Mason-Dixon line, just a beltway away from here, following this Pennsylvania County and Virginia County through all the tumult of war and emancipation. In many ways, it was a Civil War in microcosm. Now, as you just heard, in order to build this, my friends and I at the University of Virginia built basically, the technical word is insane website. Every piece of information about every person who lives in these two counties from John Brown's raid to the end of Reconstruction. Now, in our defense, we started at 6 months after the World Wide Web was introduced. We actually started before the World Wide Web was introduced, but then converted it. This is before PDF files existed, and it was not clear just how much information there might be about all these people and 10,000 pages of newspapers and all the censuses and all the letters and diaries and all that. So we launched out on it, and we worked on it for 14 years while we were doing other things. Then I wrote this first volume of it, and then I left to become a president, and it waited for me until I was finished being president, and I was able to return to it. I'm proud of it because it hasn't been touched in 10 years, and it still works, and it's used all over the world every day. That's important to know when the things that are on the web seem so transitory, except the things, of course, that we don't want to be. But generally, to build scholarship that can last is important. So as you've heard, there was a volume 1, but now we're volume 2. It's June 1863. Robert E. Lee's coming off great victories in Virginia. He's taking his army into Pennsylvania, showing the people of the United States that the Lincoln administration has failed, cannot protect them, and should be replaced with someone who would acknowledge Southern independence and bring the suffering of the war to an end. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued 6 months earlier, but it can only take effect where the Federal armies triumph. And in June of 1863, that triumph cannot be taken for granted. Now, I don't write the usual histories of all the battles. Nobody actually saw those battles, the ones that we have in our books. They were reconstructed after the fact. Instead, what it looked like on the ground were a series of fragments that people kept trying to put into a story. We begin in Chambersburg, right across the line there, the Mason-Dixon line, and Rachel Cormany is there with her baby. Now, before she had heard that the rebel soldiers might be coming, she'd seen black people fleeing ahead of the troops. She said, coming as fast as they could on all and any kind of horses, their eyes fairly protruding with fear, teams coming at the same rate, some with the covers half off, some lost, men without hats or coats. Some lost their coats as they were flying. One darky woman astride of a horse going what she could. There really was a real panic. All reported that the rebels were just on their heels. And she watched with dismay as black people became the first victims of Robert E. Lee's invasion. She wrote, "The rebels were hunting up the contrabands and driving them off by droves. Oh, how it grated on our hearts to have to sit quietly and look at such brutal deeds. I saw no men among the contrabands, all women and children. Some of the colored people who were raised here were taken along. I sat on the front steps as they were driven by, just like we would drive cattle." Now, the people of Franklin County could not see the Battle of Gettysburg 25 miles away to the east, but they could hear it. The screaming shells of cannon in the battle could be heard for over 100 miles. Rachel Cormany thought of leaving, but she didn't want to because she thought her husband Samuel might be fighting, and if he came, she wouldn't want to miss him. In fact, he had been kept at the ready in a Union cavalry unit on the top of the ridge with artillery screaming over their head, and he says it was one constant roar with rising and falling inflections. They were preparing to fight again when at 6 o'clock, news came, the Rebs were falling back. He went out on horseback to round up Confederates who were foraging or straggling. The rain came again that night. Crossing the battlefield, he said, Cemetery Hill, the great wheat field farm, Seminary Ridge, and other places where dead men, horses, smashed artillery were strewn in utter confusion. The blue and the gray mixed. Their bodies so bloated, distorted, discolored on account of decomposition having set in that they were utterly unrecognizable, save by clothing or things in their pockets. The scene simply beggars description. He's alive, though, and he realizes that he's only 25 miles from home. He tells a corporal he'd be back in the morning and sets off across the landscape. And what he finds is he was the first Union soldier they'd seen in Chambersburg and the first to bring direct news of the enemy's defeat. Everyone wanted to know what history was unfolding all around them. He said, "I'm eager to see my wife and child." He said, "It was a fun evening, but we had too many visitors." Now, here's how these same days look from the Confederate side. John and Bowden rode up and down the road alongside the train, barely able to see in the rain and dark. What he could see and hear was horrifying, even for a man who had witnessed so much suffering. Quote, "In the wagons were men wounded and mutilated in every conceivable way. Some had their legs shattered by a shell or minie ball. Some were shot through their bodies. Others had arms torn to shreds. Some had received a ball in the face or a jagged piece of shell had lacerated their heads. Scarcely 1 in 100 had received adequate surgical aid. Many had been without food for 36 hours. The ragged, bloody, and dirty clothes, all clotted and hardened with blood, were rasping the tender, inflamed lips of their gaping wounds. Very few of the wagons had straw in them, and all were without springs." And he said, as they're jolting along, a 17-mile-long wagon train of wounded in the rain, he says, basically, they begged, "Oh, God, why can't I die? Please, no one have mercy on me and in this misery." A Franklin County farmer made the mistake of lighting a lantern in his house, and it became like a beacon, and all these soldiers came and begged for water, and they took turns putting a shattered arm or head under the water while their compatriots pumped the water. This is what the Civil War actually looked like and felt like. It's not the gray team and the blue team running plays like football teams on a landscape. It's this chaos. Shenandoah Valley, throughout most of 1864, saw relentless fighting of armies and guerrillas. And by 1864, it's a great insult to the North that Robert E. Lee and the Confederates are still occupying Virginia and Richmond. And all the other victories are checkered by the fact that Lee and the Confederates are still so close to the nation's capital. So Grant drives down to Richmond, overland this time it's called, instead of trying to come around by water the way the McClellan had failed 2 years earlier, and is determined to drive Lee out of Richmond no matter what it takes. The valley is the great corridor, and one of the things that Grant says is that we've got to destroy the valley because it's still feeding Lee's army, and it's also leads us directly to Washington, D.C. Now, enslaved people in Augusta sought to take advantage of the fighting to secure their freedom. Quote, "The Negroes have had no chance to escape until now," observed one Union soldier. "We have an army of them on our hands, nearly all of them carrying great bundles of clothing hastily packed. Old men and women, children and babies, all going for freedom. For the last 4 or 5 days, I've seen an old Negro hag about 75 years of age striding along on foot with wonderful endurance and zeal. She's walking for freedom, I suppose. This is hard for us to imagine. If as much war as there had been, the enslaved people in the valley had not been able to escape because the Confederate Army is right there. The first day that they are able to find an ally, they are gone. Now, both of the largest towns in my book, Stanton and Chambersburg, were taken by the enemy in 1864, and Chambersburg was burned in July. A local Presbyterian minister described the burning in apocalyptic language. The vast and lurid column of smoke and flame rose perpendicular to the sky and spread out in a vast crown like a cloud of sackcloth hanging over the doomed city. A young merchant portrayed the human suffering. The people were running wildly through the street, carrying clothing and other articles. Others were dragging sewing machines and articles of furniture. Children were screaming after their parents, and parents were frantic after their children. The feeble efforts of the aged and infirm to carry with them some valued article from their burning homes were deeply distressing. The roaring and crackling of the flames, the falling walls, the blinding smoke, the intense heat intensified by the scorching sun, all united to form a picture of the terrible which no pen can describe nor paint or portray. It was such a sight as no one would desire to witness but once in a lifetime. And here's a town that was burned for no good reason, destroyed in one morning in July, the flame licking up against the sun. The press of the Confederacy loved it. We'd love to hear those cries of anguish, said the Richmond Dispatch. This howl of desolation and despair from the quarter in which it is heard comes upon our ear like music on the waters. It is sweet beyond all earthly gratification. Glad are we that retribution has at last put forth its terrible arm and assumed its most terrible shape. We would be glad to hear, in fact, that the whole valley of the Susquehanna was one long, unbroken, irresistible flame, not to subside as long as a house or a tree or a blade of grass or stalk of corn remains to testify that it had ever been inhabited by man. That's Americans versus Americans. And, as it would turn out, 3 months later, the Union Army comes down and burns the farms of Augusta County, devastating millions of dollars. And again, as far as we can tell, for no consequence. It does not bring the war to an end. It does not, whereas if he had actually shattered the rail line that runs from Augusta County to Richmond, it might have ended the war earlier. But instead, they devastated at both ends of the valley. While the battle surged at both ends of the valley and enslaved people seized freedom when they could, black soldiers fought the United States. And one of the many pieces of good luck I've had with this project, the largest single collection of letters by an African-American family were written to their sister by men from Pennsylvania's community who joined the famous 54th Massachusetts. Here's one of them, Jacob Christie, after fighting at Fort Wagner. We've been fighting as brave as they ever was any soldiers fought. I know if every regiment that are out and have been out would have done as well as we have, the war would be over. I do really think that it's God's will that this war shall not end till the colored people can get their rights. It goes very hard for the white people to think of it, but by God's will and power, they will have their rights. Us that are living now may not live to see it, but I shall die trying for our rights so that others that are born hereafter may live and enjoy a happy life. By the fall and winter of 1864, almost 3/4 of the men who had served with Robert E. Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia had been killed, died of disease, discharged for disease, wounded, or captured. The battered cars and locomotives from the valley brought barely enough to keep the soldiers alive. Alternating between cornmeal and flour with a small amount of beef or pork, they ate about 1,000 calories a day, half of what an adult man requires. They suffered from scurvy, night blindness, anemia, and chronic diarrhea. Nancy Emerson of Augusta saw the suffering through the eyes of the women at home. She took solace in the belief, as she said, that multitudes of our dying soldiers have been met by redeeming grace. And for evidence, she told the story of one of her neighbors who, herself dying, quote, exclaimed with delight, "Oh, there's Jimmy and Johnny. They had come for their departing mother. They were 2 of our young soldiers who had died not very long before from wounds received in battle. No one knew the state of their minds. But does not this circumstance support the hope that their pious mother's prayers had been answered for them? She saw this as evidence of the redemption and reunification of the family because, quote, these boys, the oldest was but just out of his teens, were excellent soldiers, went to the army at the first sound of the trumpet, and had never taken a furlough. Their bodies were brought home and buried in one grave. Despite all this violence, I argued that the only real turning point of the war was not a battle at all, but the election of the United States in the fall of 1864. The newspapers spent nearly as much print on that election as they did on the battles across the South. I know that you folks here in Washington are accustomed to this, but I think it's important to realize that people back then spoke harshly of their political opponents. I don't want you to be shocked when I read this. The Democrats vilified Abraham Lincoln, quote, as totally unfit for the position he holds. He is weak, incapable, vacillating, a time server without either wise comprehension of the present or sagacious forecast of the future. Through his mismanagement and imbecility during 3 years of bloody civil war, the resources of the country have been wasted, thousands of lives have been uselessly sacrificed, and millions of treasures squandered, leaving the prospect of peace and a restored union, as far as human foresight can go, as distant now as at the beginning. That's not the Confederates. That's the Democrats of the North. And the election was far closer than we like to remember. A difference of 80,000 votes in a few states would have put George McClellan into the presidency, though the difference is not evident in the Electoral College, if you can imagine that kind of thing happening. Abraham Lincoln, despite the vast stakes facing the nation, despite the Gettysburg Address, despite Union victories across the South, despite the fall of Atlanta, was able to persuade almost no Democrats to change their mind. Maybe 1% of Democrats voted for Abraham Lincoln. What it means is that 47% of white Northern men would not support Abraham freaking Lincoln in the middle of the Civil War, which is important to understand everything that followed. We tend to forget all this. You look at the textbooks and it shows all the counties that are red after Lincoln's election and say, great, that's because the nation woke up and realized what this was all about and we're all behind it, except the half of Northern men wouldn't vote for him, which means if you add up them and all white Southerners, great majority of white Americans never supported the end of slavery. Ironically, the Republicans actually grew more likely to embrace emancipation and its consequences because of the Democratic challenge. They had to defend black freedom and equality to their neighbors, to make the case they would not have made a year earlier, that black people deserved freedom. The entire country, one editorial read, foreshadowing Lincoln's great second inaugural, had been complicit in more than 2 centuries of slavery. Now the nation had an obligation to the freedmen. Quote, in this broad land of ours, under the blessing of our government, they could be made useful to themselves, the country, and posterity. Let the effort be fairly made. And so we see that something we tend to forget, that Republican candidates and papers carried a generous and humane concern for African Americans into the daily lives of white people across the North who would not otherwise been motivated to think about, much less aid, the enslaved people of the South. The party fused the self-interest and identity of voters with high moral purpose, reminding us of the good that a party can and could do. Though by the spring of 1865 it was clear the United States would win as soon as Lee could be dislodged from Petersburg, the white people of Augusta County, which had been one of the strongest Union counties in Virginia in 1860, expressed their defiance. It's important. People tend to forget 2 things. One, Virginia is the largest slave state in 1860. Okay? It's not the mid-Atlantic. It's not the outer suburbs of the District of Columbia. It's the largest slave state. But it had voted over and over again not to secede because we see a strong correlation with people who have a lot of slaves say, you know, the Constitution protects these enslaved people. I'm for the Constitutional Union Party. I'd like to have a new 13th Amendment that would guarantee slavery forever with a line across the whole country. But other than that, I'm good. So, but Virginia votes against secession until basically Lincoln says you have to decide, either give me troops or not. But then Augusta County, which voted against secession all the way past the end, becomes completely committed to the Confederacy. This is one of the great mysteries that we need to try to solve, and in fact supplied a lot of the men to Stonewall Jackson. But here's what they say in the spring of 1865. It's a public meeting, March, 3 weeks before Appomattox at the public courthouse. We have a firm and certain conviction of the justice of our cause and will maintain it at every sacrifice of blood and treasure. The watchfires of liberty, lighted in 1861, burn with undiminished brilliancy in this, the 5th year of the cruel war waged against us by our unscrupulous and vindictive foe. Our subjugation cannot be effected if our people are united, and notwithstanding the vaunted superiority of our enemy in numbers, having full faith in the justice of a righteous God, in the valor of our veteran soldiers, and in the patriotism of our people, we may and do set their threats of extermination and defiance. They say, we will never go back into the Union, and we regard, quote, such Reconstruction as but another name for submission to tyranny. So these are the most fervent Unionists in the South 3 weeks before Appomattox. The meeting in Stanton's courthouse ended with a resolution, and actually those words were written by a former Secretary of the Interior of the United States. The meeting in Stanton's courthouse ended with a resolution that would have been unthinkable only a short time before. Quote, while some of our fellow citizens oppose the arming of our Negroes, we are content with the knowledge that we have the sanction of God for using all the means in our power to resist wicked oppression. If such a step be deemed necessary and available by such men as President Davis and General Lee, and here's a chilling sentence, we shall not stop to discuss abstract questions, but will cheerfully give our servants as we have our sons to the country. That moment never came. Slavery and the Confederacy died together. No significant numbers of black men ever served in a formal military role for the Confederacy. But white Southerners entered the post-war world unshaken in their belief that they fought a war in which they were justified and virtuous and somehow had God's sanction. Maybe this was a trial because he loved them so much. So you see the origins of, well, you'll have to see right now. The white people of Augusta watched Emancipation with disbelief. One white man wrote in his diary, it's provoking, ludicrous, and pitiful all together to see the poor Negroes crowding the streets. Some of them, especially the women, dressed in all their finery, rejoicing in their freedom. The poor creatures seem to imagine that to be free cures all the ills of life. I don't know, if I've been held in perpetual bondage, I might want to get dressed up and celebrate. But the limit of imagination, and this is a man, elsewhere in his diary said, I've always hated slavery. And he has serious doubts about the Confederacy. And he actually he talks with one of his own enslaved women and helps, but his limit of imagination, because he doesn't think the Yankees are sincere in this freedom, that it's just an attempt to use the black people. As the newly freed people of Augusta began trying to unify families shattered by slavery, the Freedmen's Bureau wrote letters on their behalf. Just in the same way that Virginia was the largest slave state, Virginia would have been one of the hardest places to be enslaved because you could wake up any day and find your children sold from you. Because this was a great harvesting ground for enslaved people. This was the place where basically one of the largest industries of Virginia was selling humans that maybe had lived here for 4 generations. And as a result, when the Freedmen's Bureau comes to Stanton and people are desperately trying to find their families, they might be anywhere from the next county over the Blue Ridge to Texas or Florida or anywhere in between. The other thing the Freedmen's Bureau does is says, for the first time in your lives, you may be legally married. You know you've been married in the eyes of God and the eyes of each other, but now come forward in this book and we'll register that. 600 families came forward in Augusta County. So one of the things we can talk about, everybody knows Reconstruction was a failure. Not if you measure it by this. Not if you measure it by African American people able to seize whatever opportunity presented to restore the most important things in their lives. White Southerners fought against black rights in every way they could, legally and illegally, with violence and threat. And as a result, the Republicans of the North, 2 years after the end of the war, this is my experience speaking around the country, that the fact about American history that people understand least, because of Gone with the Wind, which you see the Yankees still walking around after burning, is that it's 2 years later that the North imposes military Reconstruction. Why? Because the white South refused to accept any of the consequences of emancipation and reunification. The white North would have been happy to have brought their sons and fathers and brothers home, but instead the white South basically forced them into Reconstruction. And with this new Reconstruction, black men would be able to vote and hold office as Virginia wrote a new constitution. And so one of the strange things about this book is that Appomattox is in the middle of it. You know, we're used to ending our story at Appomattox, hey, good game, you know, great team, blue team, no guerrilla warfare, we're a great country. Or Reconstruction, and the joke among historians is that always happens over winter break because nobody actually wants to teach Reconstruction because it's so depressing. But in fact, if you put this in the middle of the story, you realize how much war is in Reconstruction, and that you cannot understand the Civil War if you don't understand its consequences. And so this book is as much about Reconstruction as it is about war. But to do so, you have to understand so much of these subjects. You either do black or white or north or south or politics or military or women or men. You can't do it that way. We have to put them all in the mix. Everybody's shaping everybody else's vote. And you can't understand the war without understanding what it ended up meaning. Here's one of my favorite scenes. So suddenly, black men who have been silent in the historical record stand up and give us speeches, and all three white newspapers write them down, and they say the same thing. And here's Benjamin Downey, who's a minister in his 60s. Listen to a former Confederate general who'd gone to Harvard stand up and tell the black people what they needed to do to get along, and to tell them that the white Southerners were really their only true friends, that they couldn't trust the Yankees. So Reverend Downey stood up, being called for by the crowd. He says, I have no prejudice against our white people. Some are kind, some are not. But he asked a pointed question that must have occurred to many of the black people present. Why did the Southern people wait so long before becoming such good friends? The white folks South never taught us ABC. The Yankees did. The Reverend Downey reminded his listeners, black and white, quote, the Radical Party has made great sacrifices for us to give us knowledge of the living God by coming from comfortable homes north to teach us. Also, if it had been the duty of black people to care for whites during the war, a duty they fulfilled, he asked, was it not the duty of the whites when they came back to do something for this faithful race, to at least try to help educate us? But they didn't. The African men in attendance resolved their grateful thanks, quote, to the gallant armies of the United States, and held in reverent remembrance the memories of those who fell in the cause of freedom, and especially of Abraham Lincoln. They demanded that all elections employ a secret ballot, that no man shall be ineligible to office by reason of sect or color, that they be admitted to jury list, that whipping and maiming be prohibited, and that taxes be fairly assigned. And then they call for something so radical in the history of Virginia, the free education of the young of all classes. To promote and protect these purposes, the black men in Stanton would look with contempt upon any who were willing to sell this dear-bought right for a mess of pottage. So don't listen to your employer when he's trying to say that you won't have a job on next Monday if he sees you vote next Tuesday. We've got to stick together to make sure that this hard-fought freedom endures. Now, the white newspaper, The Spectator, printed the demands and resolutions and warned black men against acting on them. Surely, the editor thought, Augusta's black people, quote, have no ill will toward those who have shown them only kindness throughout their lives. The white people of the county should have sincere conversations with the black people they knew, explaining that Southern white people had nothing to do with bringing black people into slavery from the wilds of Africa, they said. The transatlantic slavery trade had been the work of New England. The black people of Augusta had become free only through the exigencies of war, not through the intention of the Yankees. And the free people should know that the Republicans held no desire to see them awarded justice, but simply that power and spoils might remain in the hands of them. Quote, no crumb of which will go to those who wear dusky skins. And the white people of the South were amazed that black people didn't. Yeah, that's right. Teachers came down from the north in large numbers, including Augusta. Sarah Davidson wrote touchingly of the children. The northern teacher admitted that, quote, I did not expect to find so many pretty and interesting children among colored people. There are some pretty and smart children in our school. Some of them are quite small and yet are almost the best and farthest advanced scholars we have, and look as bright as they are in reality. It's a pleasure to see their pleasant and happy faces. She wrote of one trip, the people were much pleased to see us. One of my scholars, a little girl, was standing upon a hill near her house. We saw her before she saw us, but as we drew near her, she recognized us, and we soon knew she did. She stood a minute looking at us, then threw up her hands and shouted a welcome turn and ran off as fast as she could to tell her mother that we were coming. This is Reconstruction too. This doesn't happen without Reconstruction. This doesn't happen without the Freedmen's Bureau, but it also doesn't happen without thousands of young women risking their lives, frankly, to come teach the pretty young colored children, as I said. Now, the process of shaping the memory of the war began even as the war was ending. A procession to the city cemetery was the longest ever seen in Stanton, quote, being nearly a mile in length and supposed to number 2,500 persons. Reaching the cemetery, children spread flowers across 2,000 grave sites. After the harsh divisions that had long torn at Augusta County for the preceding 5 years, with elections, war, and privation setting people against each other, the unity among white people was cathartic. Quote, tottering age and tender youth united in a harmonious and heartfelt offering to our dead kindred and friends, and not forgetting the stranger who battled shoulder to shoulder with our loved and fallen ones, and now takes his last sleep by their side. The next labor will be to disinter and have the remains of the soldiers from the ditches, farms, and fields around Stanton brought to the cemetery and properly buried. It took them years to find all the bones and bodies in all the out-of-the-way places where men had crawled off to die. In this ceremony, the people celebrated Stonewall Jackson, who had led a brigade of men filled with men from Augusta, now laid all around them. They read poems elevating Jackson, alternating between Confederate and Christian hymns. On the same days, African Americans of Stanton staged Decoration Day ceremonies, celebrating the end of slavery and the triumph of federal troops in Virginia. Hundreds of black people marched through town in the opposite direction to the National Cemetery of the United States soldiers on the outskirts on the other side of Stanton. The formerly enslaved people put American flags on the graves of the men who had helped end slavery. The struggle over memory stretched for years after the war. When news of the death of Robert E. Lee spread in the fall of 1870, the newspapers of Stanton bordered their entire pages in heavy black symbols of mourning. Quote, Virginia, sorrow-laden, bends in agony over the loss of her greatest, purest, and best beloved son. The Southland weeps, the nation mourns him gone, the whole world unites in sorrowing sympathy. Our beloved and noble old leader is dead, but his memory will live forever in the hearts of his countrymen, and his name will be honored through all time. Bells tolled across the hills of Stanton, and all businesses closed. But while many in the North did admire Lee, the Republican newspaper in Franklin could not forgive him. Quote, whilst other civil and military leaders failed and disappeared under the turbulent waves of the war, General Lee seemed to rise higher and higher until during at least the last year of the struggle, the only hope of the South was centered on him. With that power, Lee's refusal to surrender when it had become clear that the Confederacy could no longer win wasted many Northern and Southern lives. Upon him, quote, far more than upon any person does the responsibility of all the sacrifices of the last year of the war lie. And his final failure came in the years of peace, the 5 years that he had after Appomattox, when he withdrew entirely from public life, abstained from all intercourse with the public, and gave no public expression to his opinions, saying nothing to heal the wounds, playing the part of a discontented, dissatisfied old man. Though he could have done more for the permanent good and material prosperity of Virginia and the whole South than any other man in the country, he refused to open his mouth. The Republican paper could not bring itself to offer the customary absolution of the dead. It ended with the admonition that Americans, quote, should simply let Lee's deeds be buried in the grave with his body. So this idea that the argument over Robert E. Lee is new, as you see, it began the day that he died. So what do we make of this remarkable story? How do we explain how in less than 10 years, a system of slavery with nearly 4 million people in it was destroyed, to be followed by the most ambitious expansion of rights in the world? Now, we usually, and rightly, focus on the people who delivered the United States to this remarkable victory, Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses Grant. And there's no doubt that few other men could have accomplished what they did. But my argument, embodied in the stories you've just heard, is that we actually appreciate their accomplishments more if we acknowledge what they were up against on every front. The opponents of freedom fought so long and hard during and after the war that the U.S. government, the U.S. Army, and a small majority of the white northern population were empowered to destroy the roots of slavery and put a new constitutional order in its place. The white Southerners who briefly called themselves the Confederacy played a critical role in bringing slavery to an end. Without their secession, emancipation was constitutionally impossible. Without their prolonged war, emancipation was politically impossible. Without their violent resistance to the freedom of the people they had held as slaves, there would have been no radical Reconstruction. As one Republican paper put it, the white South had committed the colossal suicide of world history. Other losers shaped the story as well. The Northern Democrats opposed the Republicans so tenaciously at every step during and after the war that the Republicans strengthened their support for emancipation and then, just as remarkably, for rights for the freed people. The Republicans knew that they did not pass the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution, 15th Amendment, 5 years after the war is over, that the gains of the war could be erased by a coalition of Southern whites and sympathetic Northern whites who built their entire party around white supremacy across the entire nation. Southern whites thus played a critical, if unwitting, role in the ongoing moral, legal, and political accomplishments of the civil rights struggle. Without the 14th Amendment, they would not have had the same foundation on which to build. I always get asked, what if Abraham Lincoln had not been killed? We can talk about that if you want to. The enslaved people of the South and their African-American allies in the North played the other critical role, even though they were apparently the most powerless of all at the beginning of the war. They drove toward emancipation from the first days of the war, and they drove the fight for rights and equality all the way through Reconstruction and its aftermath, resisting even after the white South stripped away every right that it could over the next century of disfranchisement and segregation. So this is kind of like a little core sample of the book. You see what it's like. It's basically me yelling at you like that for hundreds of pages. I know it makes you want to read it. But the idea is that we can't understand these issues with broad generalizations by sort of abstract categories and by rushing to the end of the story. I always quote my mom, who's a fifth grade teacher, And I told her I was going to go to graduate school in history, and she said, well, what for, honey? We already know what happened. That's the problem with all of this. We already know what happened. We've got to forget that it happened if we're going to understand the drama and the fact that it happened at all. Now the part I like, which is talking with you. So let's hear our conversation. Thanks.
You really don't yell at us for those 500 pages.
Great,
Not in the slightest. So now we move to our discussion period. We ask that you wait for the microphone to reach you after we've called on you. Please identify yourself and please use the microphone. But I get the first question. This is history on a human scale. You write early in the introduction to the book, and it is indeed that. And what you do so well in the pages that follow is to provide the human dimension of what it is like on both sides of the political military divide for whites, for African Americans, and the like. My question with that in mind...
That's all we have time for today. Thanks very much.
Good night. So the question has to do with audience and who you're communicating to in this book. Because as I read this, and I'm not a Civil War historian, but I dabble in the scholarship, and I have over the past 30 or so years, ditto for Reconstruction. Your work has done so much to kind of shape how people think about this period. But what I read is a story that I'm familiar with to a large extent because I read people like you and others in the academy. And so you use the word we need to forget, we need to do this. And so I'm wondering if this is a book for an audience of non-academics, because it's immensely readable, unlike a lot of academic, not all, but a lot of academic work. And so if this is a book for kind of a broader educated readership, what would you say to academics who read the book? How would you want them to think differently about this period? Or is it that you're just drawing on the vast amount of work that's been done really over the last 50 years, and you're using that structure to kind of refashion it to tell a story that you want far more people to be aware of?
Yeah, I was trying to have my cake and eat it too in this. And when you buy a case of the book, because it's a wonderful gift for any occasion, you'll see that it's written as close to a novel on most of the pages as I can, but then I have what I call voiceovers along the way, in which are in italics, in which we step back and we're not in that story, and I'm not just trying to submerge in, but what do we make of it? Each one of those voiceovers is actually an historiographic argument. I began this adventure back in the 90s, and I wrote an essay called Worrying About the Civil War. And I argued that the things that we like the best, Ken Burns, Killer Angels, and my good friend James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, had all settled on a story in which the best of America triumphs. And that it's sort of built in because the North was modern and the South was anti-modern. And that... there's a book called, I don't know much about history. You can still get it at Barnes & Noble. And it says, quickly, what was the Civil War all about? Well, it says the North was in many ways marching toward today, whereas the South was stuck in the past. So you're right, Eric, that today we're used to the idea that slavery was a modern institution. When I wrote that, and when I wrote the idea that the North was so divided, I'd say that even today, I'm unusual in emphasizing the Northern Democrats as much as I do. And I would say that I'm a little unusual in emphasizing how much the Confederacy actually hung on till the very end. So the book doesn't really follow any particular historiographic school, but I would say that I try to persuade people to think in a revisionist way. And I think that in the 90s, when I began all this project, it felt that the orthodoxy was that things turned out pretty much ultimately as they were determined to do. And the theme that I introduced in Volume 1 was called Deep Contingency, in which, and you've heard it here, they're invoking God at the end of all of this. They invoked God to save the Union a week earlier. Then they invoked God for the Confederacy 2 weeks later. That people can change their view of the universe that quickly, I call deep contingencies, the interplay of the deepest structures of our identity with the interplay of events. So I'd be curious. I haven't gotten a bad review yet. Some have not been fully sensitive to every accomplishment I've made, but nobody's really argued with me yet. I'll be curious to see. It's partly because I kind of argue with everybody and kind of agree with everybody. So there's lots of things that people could disagree with about guerrilla warfare, a lot about the destructiveness of the war. People could disagree about whether it was a good thing that the African-American families were put together, as it were, with the sanction of a husband being in control. People could argue that, and I would say the main person that would disagree with me is my friend James Oakes, who says that there was a lot more intentionality of the Republicans from well before the Civil War, and what you saw was the unfolding of the process that they had put into place. I have a lot more people making each other's history, and you could argue that that's a weaker kind of history than a straightforward, that they knew what they wanted, they went after it, and they accomplished it. So now that you think about it, I'm going to make everybody angry.
I'm not so sure about that. All right, let's start here with the gentleman in the middle, and the microphone's coming to you.
My name's Dean Herron. I'm the regional historian for the National Park Service for the National Capital Region. I just want to make a comment. I think you would agree with this, but in your discussion of the Freedmen's Bureau schools, it's probably true that there would have been no African-American schools without the Freedmen's Bureau. But I think it's also equally true there would have been no schools without the leadership and sacrifices of African-Americans themselves. And they have often been overlooked, I think, in the whole story. In fact, just calling them Freedmen's Bureau schools as opposed to Freedmen's schools. And I'm sure you would agree with that. I am assuming, having read your work and
Yeah, I would, and since you asked a question like that, I have to say something back, and here's what I say, which is you actually see quite a bit of contestation between schools run by the white people who come down under the sanction of the Freedmen schools and the black people who run the schools themselves. As soon as they have any opportunity to do so, they do. And so sometimes they collaborate, sometimes they're in tension. And I would say the Freedmen's Bureau is often in favor of the white missionaries who are coming down, and the black people who are running schools have to do it themselves by taking penny tuitions along the way. So that's my only distinction there, is that it's important. Something I say, I use wherever I'm going, you guys are a tough audience for this regard, because usually what I say is that wherever I go, I insult the people who are nice enough to invite me. That if I go to the South, my fellow white Southerner, it's slavery and injustice, right? I go to the North or the West. I spoke at Berkeley 2 days ago. It's like, get over yourselves. You know, you weren't, it's some people who were brave enough to work for black rights. It's not just by the sanction that you're Yankees or Westerners. You had choices to make, and a lot of you made the wrong choice. So I do this in order to emphasize that the black young women, the young white women who did this were doing something meaningful. And so, as Eric was saying, if there's a risk to the book, I actually take everybody seriously. I actually take everybody's suffering real. So you hear me talking about how bad it felt for the Confederates to watch their children be killed, right? Even if it's their own fault. So I think that there's a case where you put the children at the center, and you'd see that they were glad to have whatever education they could get wherever they could. But I take your point, because you're right, but I couldn't just take it. I had to discuss it.
Eric, I'd like just to pick up on, you just mentioned the young women who came to teach. In your book, you talk about the struggles over boundaries, and you talk about geography, slavery, political parties, and gender. And can you elaborate on that a little bit? Did it go beyond what are you talking about, more than these women who came after the war?
Yeah, throughout that you find that women and men have different interests in what's going to happen in this war. And there's a place to, everything I say, there's a historic historiographic debate about. Everything I talk about here is like a battlefield. There's a case, the argument has been, did white Southern women help destroy the Confederacy by their withholding of support and enthusiasm for it? And Drew Faust was associated with that argument. Or, on the other hand, as people argue, no, they were the glue that held it all together. Well, I try to show in the book how you could be the glue and turn into the solvent as soon as it was your husband stuck in Petersburg, where he's just sitting there rotting and it's not doing any good, there's no movement, and you know that he could come home and for 2 weeks on furlough and help the family. And then people who might have been women who could have been darning socks and aiding the Confederacy would then write a single letter and say, basically, come home, and then be the agents of desertion, right? So that's how, and it's because of their position in the household. And so you find, we're used to kind of the florid language that the Army, the people of the 19th century men would direct at women. It's because they knew so much depended on their opinion. And in the North as well, they knew a lot of political identities actually comes from the family you marry into and what the women are saying along the way. And black people, too, are having to figure out in all of this, where does your loyalty lie, in some ways to your children or to the man that you are with. So I think that, if we think of gender not as just something to deploy every once in a while as an analytical category, but as a fundamental way that people see the world at every step. I think, to Eric's point, I'm not always waving the flag and saying, and now I'm going to talk about gender, or I'm going to talk about race, or I'm going to talk about class. I just do it. And the danger is, I've found that some of my fellow historians think that's not enough, but I'd rather people enter into the story without me always calling attention to myself. So that's what I mean. It's salient throughout the war and throughout Reconstruction. So that's what I mean. All right? I'm not calling on people. I'm just answering after you. Am I calling on people?
I'm calling on people.
Yeah, that's what I thought. My hands are down. I have no responsibility.
Gentleman right up here.
You mentioned that Democrats stayed Democrats. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat, right? And he was chosen for the National Unity Party. Not one of Lincoln's better choices.
They thought so at the time.
That's the question. Did he actually affect voters in the places you looked at?
Well,
did it make any difference at all
I
for
want to
voting?
be honest with everybody. I went to Andrew Johnson Elementary School. And there's only 2 in the United States, both in East Tennessee, where I'm from. And I don't believe it's colored my thinking at all. But I would say this. Andrew Johnson was widely admired in the North as the bravest white Southern who did what Lincoln hoped and thought millions of other white Southern men would do, which is to stay loyal to the United States. He was the only United States senator from the South who didn't walk out with the Confederacy. Then he risked his life by being governor of Tennessee during the war. And so the Republicans, why would they do this? Well, it's because that is Lincoln's vision of what the future is going to be, is that there are going to be white Southerners who will join with people of goodwill of the North to put the country back together. So, and when Lincoln is assassinated, the initial response is, well, thank goodness we have Andrew Johnson to take his place. The Democrats and Republicans both say that, right? Precisely because he's the person who had the courage to be for union when everything else should have pushed him to be for disunion. So it was, and in his own mind, he was doing what he thought Lincoln was going to do. We don't know what Lincoln was going to do. Lincoln doesn't have much to say really about Reconstruction. His last words were something like, I'll get back to you about Reconstruction. And I'm not kidding, and I'm being facetious. That after he announced that there were some black men who deserved to vote, which was enough for John Wilkes Booth to kill him, but he did not have a whole plan. Johnson thought that Lincoln's goal was to put the country back together, and you couldn't do it with only black Southerners and white Northerners. So I think that, and then he completely bungled it, and it was terrible. And so I don't defend him throughout. I'm just saying at the moment he was elected, that he was nominated, then elected, and then assumed office, he was not the disaster that he seems so obviously to be now.
Just curious, is it still called Andrew Jackson Elementary?
Johnson.
Johnson, I mean.
It is. Yeah, it is.
Really?
Yep.
Wow.
We do have a Jackson and a Lincoln, too. We also have a Frederick
Even
Douglass,
so.
which gives you an idea of how the town was structured, that it was segregated. And so, but yes,
Well, thank
Andrew
you.
John, yeah.
On this side here, how about Jim Banner in the middle?
James Banner.
Hi.
Ed and Eric, if I may go back to your question, Eric, your kind of question. Over my 50 years as a professional historian, the historiography of the Civil War has changed drastically, vastly, and you've been one of those who've helped shift it so radically. And now the historiography of the Civil War is not just battles and generals and politicians, but it's nurses and women and freed blacks and slaves and soldiers and so
Right.
forth and so on. Where do we go from here? Amy, what are the next steps in Civil War historiography? If there are any that are now definable, we certainly can have more books like your own and on many other subjects. But is there any direction in which you think historians should now be going with Civil War and Reconstruction?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that's also all the time we have for today. I think you're right. There's been a great harvesting of all the people who were left out of the story. And that's kept us busy for a long time. And it's been a great act of recovery and of humane scholarship. And I think we tend to diminish scholarship more than we should. I don't think our museums look the way they do had scholars not been doing that. I think what I was trying to do is, what if we took all that recovery and put all those people in interaction on the same stage to show how they were all making all their own histories. We have a lot of histories of categories of people, is what we have, you know? And we have, you know, important histories of the Northern Democrats. Well, yeah, but you can't understand without the Northern Republicans, and you can't understand what's happening. So that's what I've tried to do, and the reason it took me, you know, two books to do 2 counties is kind of, I recognize I don't even like to think of it that way, but I just said it, but because that's really what it is. But why? It's not because I care about those 2 counties. It's because that's the only way to have a history with a core sample that has all the actors making each other's histories. I think in some ways right now we had revisionism in the 1930s in which historians agreed the Civil War had been a terrible mistake. The blundering generation. Then World War II, what were we thinking? No, it was natural, inevitable, and good. Then we had, in the 70s, a few people said, well, yeah, they didn't go far enough. Actually, it became the orthodoxy that didn't go far enough. And then some people said, well, you know, it didn't go far enough for exactly the opposite reason. You know, so you're right. Every decade, there's a new take on all this. Have we come to a position of exhaustion? I don't think so. I'm exhausted, but I think that we're in sort of post-revisionism now. And I think if we imagine that you can write 1,000 pages about 2 counties, how many complexities are still out there for all the other thousands of counties? You do see a movement of the last 10 or 15 years that people are deciding that looking at boundaries is actually a good idea. There's a flurry of books now. Places are looking at Missouri boundaries, but also on both sides of the Ohio and all that. Because when I first began this project, people who believed the orthodoxy is that the North and the South were fundamentally different societies based on fundamentally different economic systems and different moral systems. Look at Massachusetts and South Carolina, right? You look at industrial versus agrarian, which is just like it's one of the most deeply embedded myths in American history, because we like it because we're kind of industrial and they were good. So you get the idea. And so I remember Jim McPherson wondering is if I'm looking too close to the border, am I looking at places where things are watered down? Why do I look at the border? Because 200 miles apart, same soil, same climate, same ethnicities, same religions, and they kill each other within months. Why? One place has slavery, the other doesn't. So ironically, by putting slavery at the center, but not taking it for granted as a great moral barometer that's going to separate the North from the South, but as something that has to be fought over every day, then it looks different, right? So I think there's a lot more to be gained from understanding that slavery was not simply a cause, but was an agent, an active force all the way through. I do think that we've been kind of, Eric Foner's great book from 1988, we have sort of decided that's what happened. And I'm gently pushing against that a little bit by saying, yeah, it was critical that black people were doing everything they could to advance the story, and I show that. Matter of fact, my book ends, not to ruin it for anybody, but to show how people in the New South period could seize these small victories of Reconstruction to build new lives and political power for themselves. Not because the white North was so great, because they were so great, and they took these brief moments. So I think that if we have more war in Reconstruction, if we understand the politics were driven by the same forces that led people into war, not just in the things that they're arguing about in Reconstruction. We all know the power Vietnam still has today, right? We can all see what the long wars that we're fighting now, how they imagine what the Civil War did for decades. So we'll pretend that there was an answer in there somewhere, but I think it's not likely to be a sudden pivot around the hard things that we've learned over the last 50 years, but rather an exploration of their implications. Okay, thanks.
There's a woman in the back there.
I'm Mary Jo Binker. I wanted to follow up on your statement that you take everyone's suffering seriously in your book. Yeah. And I wondered if you thought that that might be kind of a gateway for us now today to maybe begin to talk to one another?
Yeah, I think that I'm on the commission in Richmond to discuss what we do with the monuments, and I was in Charlottesville the day that Charlottesville became that event. And so I've had to wrestle with this a lot. And, in Richmond, we have 1,500 letters and emails now that we've solicited and lots of public meetings. There was one week where I went to the Sons of Confederate Veterans one day and the Unitarian Universalist Church the next, and didn't hear exactly the same things. And so when I'm out talking about this, people say, well, Dr. Ayers or Ed, what do you think? And I said, I'm a civil servant right now. My job is not to have an opinion. But here's what I will do. I will argue with whatever you say. What do you think? And I will argue with people because I've heard the other side. And I do think that a lot of times in this debate and in Civil War in general, our words get in our way of understanding. To understand somebody doesn't mean that you're going to agree with them or erase the moral weight of what they say, but it means that you begin by having an idea of why they think what they do. So volume 1 of this was, why in the world would the South secede, and why in the world would the North sacrifice 350,000 men to stop them from seceding, right? The question in this book, how in the world out of that mess did the end of slavery come? Right? Neither of those things are obvious, but they both begin with an assumption that we can't know if we don't listen to what they're saying. Yes, I do believe what you said is true, that if we're going to move forward, we're actually going to have to pay attention to what the other side is saying. And is there any, even if there's not truth in it, what motivation is in it? And what might persuade them to change their minds? So, everything I've ever done is kind of dripping with this kind of, you can call it sentimentality or empathy or whatever. One of my former students was teaching one time, and he signed one of my earlier books, and this football player came up and said, this book reads like it's written by a woman. And my friend said, why? He says, it's all about empathy. And it is all about that. That's my only historic belief. Let's begin with empathy and see where we go from there.
Anita, in the front.
Anita, yeah. I'll try to give shorter. I see lots of hands, so I'll try to be more pithy. Still empathetic, but pithy.
Arnita Jones, retired history bureaucrat. I'd like to look at another set of consumers for your scholarship. As a retiree, I've been putting some time into family history. And in our two families, one of the things that you can't avoid is the Civil War. I was surprised about that. I was kind of shocked.
You've not been reading all my stuff? Or
All goes back. Well, anyway.
Yeah, I know.
But it's a huge community of people. They're not exactly scholars, but they're not people who are not careful about what they're doing or who are not serious about what they're doing. There's a lot of work of family historians, genealogists, whatever you want to call them, that's out there. And I have the sense that it's a parallel thing going along, and that scholarship is yet another road, but they're not bumping up against each other that much. It was not to say who someone is doing a lot of work on Civil War ancestors won't pick up a couple of good books or more than that. But I mean, do you see any intersection between those two worlds?
Yeah. Well, I gave the presidential address to the OAH a couple weeks ago.
Yes, I'm sorry.
And I called for all practitioners of history to realize that we're on the same team. And this idea that academics are somehow different puts a divide between us. We're all, and I would say I got a really touching email. It means the Valley of Shadow, if you're a genealogist, it's heaven. But I did it before Ancestry or Chronicling America or any of that stuff. And so I think that the difference is I do other people's genealogy. I do think that these are deeply related, and they both are evidence-based. That's our path for communication on this. And the things that people count as evidence is in the same way that our cast of characters is greatly expanding. The things that we can now understand are evidence is greatly expanding. The revolution we're living through with the digital, billions of words of newspapers we never had before, right? And the genealogical material, whenever we find ways to find the patterns in that, and that's what I'm doing now. I'm working a lot with the digital things, and I could talk about later, but we got all these questions about this book. I think the future lies in finding complex connections and patterns in a new bounty of evidence. That's what I think.
Let's have this gentleman right here, and then we'll move to this side.
I was looking for side equity here.
We'll get to it.
My name is David Coper. I live in Rockingham County in the countryside. We're surrounded by Confederate flags. My grandfather fought with the 93rd Ohio Volunteers, so that puts us in an interesting position out there. I wondered if you'd answered your own question that you put forward about the difference in the attitudes at the beginning and at the end of the war in Augusta County having to do with the Union.
I'm sure I did answer my own question. I would say generally, ideology follows action rather than the other way around. People find themselves acting in ways and then spin a rationalization for why that is. They never decided, yes, I'm ready to sacrifice my sons in defense of a doomed would-be nation. They take it one step at a time. And I have a little formula I have. White Southerners did not go to war to defend slavery. They went to war to defend a nation based on slavery, right? And so if you don't have that nation, that understanding of that connection, they don't do it. So they did it and then once the suffering, once the sacrifice, once the mistake has been made, then people double down. And so the people who write Virginia's Constitution of Reconstruction are from Stanton, are from Augusta County, the same Unionists. And what's their goal? To get former Confederates enfranchised and to create a constitution in which black people then can be marginalized almost immediately. And so you find people within 10 years going from being servants of the United States, loving America, to crafting a constitution that's in fundamental tension with the American Constitution. But the flip side of this is you find white northern men who never would have thought of admiring a black man, admiring the United States colored troops who come marching back into Franklin County after helping save the United States. When I speak to young people, I tell them something all of you already know, that what's this story show? That things that are much worse than we can imagine can happen. And things that are much better than we can imagine can also happen. The kind of either smug acceptance of self-congratulations or fatalism are both ahistorical. There's no reason to think that what we have today is what we're going to have tomorrow. And if we can go into the greatest crisis the nation has ever found and see those two things playing out in individual lives, it gives us greater warning about today, but also can give us greater hope.
And now, this side. Gentleman in the back, and then we'll move to the wall. Oh. Up. Microphone.
Yeah, Tom Adams. I was interested in terms of shift in Northern attitudes. I remember reading kind of an interesting book by a researcher who had read thousands of letters of Northern troops, and her argument was that their experience actually solidified their support for anti-slavery and for the Union cause. I just wondered what you thought of that.
I do. And hey, and thanks to the NEH for making all this possible. And I'm not kidding. None of this happens at the NEH back in 1995 when the idea of doing something on the web seemed insane, stepped up. The Valley of the Shadow wouldn't have existed. So thanks, Tom. I think it's a book and a person I admire, but I don't think you can read a bunch of letters out of context and find a pattern in them. For the same answers that I've given here, people are saying profoundly different things from one year to the next. Are one of those things wrong or insincere? No, they're solving a different problem. Do I think that there are Northern soldiers who are anti-slavery from the beginning? No doubt about it. Do I think that there are Northern soldiers who become more anti-slavery once they actually meet enslaved people and see their longing for freedom and capacity for freedom? Yes. Do I think that the North as a whole becomes more anti-slavery over the course of the war? And again, the same thing. Once they act to end slavery, then they come to see the wisdom and the justice in it. So I think all those things are true. The looking for patterns in large numbers of letters is kind of what I was saying before about it's a categorization of strategy that we followed. But if you believe what I'm telling you, then a letter in March and a letter in June, say before and after Appomattox, mean different things. So I'm all about taking the words of the people who are doing the actions seriously, but part of that means letting them be in their story context.
Right up here against the wall.
I'm Will Amatruda. I had ancestors on both sides of that war. You mentioned the anti-secession sentiment in Augusta County. I believe you even said it was the most anti-secession county in the state. Well, not county, what became West Virginia, perhaps.
Right. Even more than some counties that became West Virginia.
Yeah. But wasn't a lot of that opposition to secession seen as the best way to preserve slavery?
Yes.
I understand one unionist argued, if we secede, we've just moved the Canadian border 200 miles south to the Ohio River. We're going to lose a lot more runaway slaves that way.
No, exactly. And, you know, when I visited my friends in Augusta and gave a speech to the Augusta County Historical Society, where it's now less than 5% African American. So the Valley has seen a great out-migration of black people, mainly in the 1940s and 1950s, because there's no opportunity there, right? And there's also a lot of injustice, right? So that's one of the patterns we have to break. This idea that to be against secession was to be against slavery. Matter of fact, there's no statistical correlation between percentage of slaveholders in a county and their votes for secession. That's another way of resisting the story we've told, you see in our textbooks, when you got the deeper the South, the more secessionists. As it turns out, Virginia is more committed to the Confederacy than Georgia over the course of the war, because there's nothing like having the enemy in your house to make you hate the enemy. right? So that's the whole story. We need to get past this idea that there's the real South and then the marginal South. The thing is that slavery created a force field around it, and it could take different forms. And so the irony is those anti-secession people who were pro-slavery, and that was all of them, were right. The South put this at risk for no reason at all. Slavery was growing stronger by the day. It was counting for an ever larger share of the American economy. The South was could have expanded into Cuba and Central America. They gave it all away, I believe, out of arrogance, out of a belief that they would, of course, win because they were so powerful, not because they were on the losing, not because they were not modern enough. It's because they thought they had found the formula where you would combine being one of the richest societies on earth, the fourth richest economy in the world by yourself, with the stability over labor that comes from race. They didn't do it out of defensiveness. They were playing offense. So, yes.
A gentleman in the back right there. And then we'll go to the other person in the far back.
With due respect, I'd like to challenge a very basic thing
Okay.
macro thing you said about slavery and the Confederacy.
Okay.
Your view is that slavery and the Confederacy died together. The vision of what the Confederacy was, it seems to me, transcended slavery. What it was described most succinctly in the Confederate States of America Constitution. In its preamble, it eliminated the concept of perfect union. It eliminated the concept of general welfare. And it eliminated the concept of common defense. All of the elements which held us together, they replaced it with the only constraint that they recognized, which was the constraint of Almighty God. That is the Confederate Constitution, their vision of America. I believe that vision of America has prevailed. Your comments about how Reconstruction reestablished, how it was defeated so abruptly after the war, coincides with this, as does its resetting in the Gilded Age, its resetting in the period just before the Depression, and the resetting today in a vision which basically says that we exist to exploit, to permit the exploitation of the environment, human beings, the birds and the fowl, constrained only by Almighty God. To me, that is where we are right now. And it is a reflection of the vision of the Confederate States of America.
That's very eloquent. I think you give the Confederate States of America too much credit. I think slavery and the Confederacy do die together. Slavery is slavery. It is not something like slavery. Only in slavery can they buy and sell your children. Okay? So the poverty that follows is not slavery. The Confederacy becomes a fantasy nation, and I do think it has some of the ideology you're talking about, it's real. But we can't, and I've written about all the other things that you talk about, lynching and segregation and disfranchisement, so I believe you on those as well. In the same way, we can't give the nation moral credit forever for ending slavery, but have to take into account the accomplishments of one generation after the next of black people and of white people of goodwill. we also have to recognize that evil is created over and over again as well. And so I think that you and I actually agree in this regard, but the point is that the raw materials that fed into the Confederacy remained alive, but they had to be assembled and reassembled and breathed back into life over and over again. There's strong continuities in American history, but we have to pay close attention to who exactly is doing exactly what to exactly whom, is all that I would say. But your statement was really good, but I therefore had to resist it just for self-pride.
There's a person in the far back there, right there. Very patient.
Hi. Firstly, I'm grateful that I'm a proud parent of University of Richmond.
All right, go Spiders.
I have two short questions. Yes. Number one, what is opinion that the civil rights was enacted only almost 100 years after the end of the Civil War?
Yes.
Number two, the recent removal of the Stephen Foster sculpture at Pittsburgh. Let me rethink what is the cultural impact of the end of the slavery system or the Civil War in terms of the rise of the Jim Crow shows, jazz, and blues music industry. So we'd like to hear your opinions, please.
Okay. Why does it take 100 years for the civil rights movement? White opposition and injustice and power. I think a question might be, how, after 100 years of white injustice and power and disfranchisement and violence, does the great moral revolution of American history take place among the most oppressed people in the nation? Where do Southern African American people find the moral strength and political power to launch that? And we don't want to forget, they were the ones who did it. It's a direct legacy of the people who taught themselves to read in Reconstruction, who built their own churches, who built their own fraternal organizations, who kept their families together in the face of every kind of opposition. The civil rights movement is impossible to understand if we don't understand that the African American population in the United States is the most successful post-emancipation society in the Western Hemisphere. They're successful because they were able to sustain the power to create people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. This is where our stories are kind of at odds. A frank acknowledgement of the injustice can make the victims of that injustice seem immobilized. If you act as if you don't fully understand the depth of that injustice by emphasizing that, say, by 1910, 80% of all rural black Virginians owned land, it doesn't mean anybody gave them anything. It meant that despite all those things, they were able to build lives for themselves. So the balancing act for all of this is to understand black accomplishment in the face of white opposition. It's not to suggest that because black people succeeded some ways that the white opposition was less. So why 100 years? It took that long for this power to build, and it took World War II, the situation again. All history, everything is context for everything else, okay? So we'll pretend that was a good answer to that, okay? The second question is, how does this fit into the great cultural accomplishments of American history, which are fundamentally rooted in African American culture? America's really unique cultural contributions to the world come very heavily out of African American culture. I would say I have written about this in my 1992 book, The Promise of the New South, where I talk about the invention of blues and jazz and country and gospel music, as well as Pentecostal religion. I will end with this statement. I sometimes ask people, tell me something that happened in the South between Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement. And generally people can't tell me any event. They can just say it was injustice. Yeah, I said nothing happened except the creation of America's only unique contributions to world culture, the creation of the most visible name brand in the world, the invention of the most rapidly growing religions in the world. Other than that, nothing happened. But they've been invisible to us because we're kind of locked into the story of the South as a place where nothing changes. Instead, what you've seen is a place where everything is always changing and mostly in struggle. But what it does mean is that the South can change, and I believe it will.
On that very eloquent and powerful note, I unfortunately have to draw this to a close. I will invite you back next week when Jill Norgren will present on her new book, A Life in the Law, Tales from 20th Century Women Lawyers. Thank you to our participants, and thank you to Edward Ayers.
Thanks, everybody.